They bulldozed my cacti in the middle of the night? That was my first clue something was horribly wrong. I had driven out to my desert sanctuary just after dawn, expecting the usual stillness broken only by distant coyote calls, and instead I found a chain-link fence, bright yellow excavators, and rows of stumps where my century-old saguaros once stood. My heart pounded and my mind raced. A sign stuck in the sand read, "Future site of hillside trails, HOA private property, no trespass." None of it made any sense. This was my land, my father's land before me. Who in their right mind would dare claim it? I stared at the sign, refusing to believe its bold black lettering. Had they built an entire gated community right under my nose? I'm Mark Spencer, a man who's lived most of his life in the dust and sunshine of southwestern Arizona. My father was something of a desert rat, a man who taught me to appreciate the austere beauty of open horizons. Over decades, he pieced together a large parcel of land that sprawled across a remote corner of the county. We never intended to develop it. We wanted it wild, protected from the relentless wave of suburban sprawl that swallowed every cactus, every tumbleweed, every desert hare that got in its way. While Dad was alive, he spent half his time caring for that land, filling water troughs for migrating wildlife, monitoring rare desert plants, making sure unscrupulous developers stayed far away. Yet here I was, confronted with a view that contradicted everything he'd stood for. Half-finished houses with red-tiled roofs arranged in neat uniform rows, complete with a wide paved boulevard lined by fresh landscaping that had no place in a desert environment. My hands trembled as I unlatched the chain-link fence. A security guard in a green polo shirt emerged from behind a portable office trailer, walking briskly in my direction. He looked me up and down, asked if I had HOA permission to be on site. I laughed. A short, disbelieving bark that even startled me. "HOA permission? This is my property," I snapped. The guard didn't budge, repeating the words, "You'll have to speak to Ms. Delgado, the HOA president." Then he gestured at the trailer, stepping aside to let me pass. Inside, I found a small reception area. A woman in a crisp blazer, short dark hair, and a phone pressed to her ear glanced at me. She held up a hand for me to wait, kept whispering on her call, though I couldn't catch the details. Finally, she hung up, setting her phone on the desk with a practiced calm. "Mr. Spencer," she greeted me, though I'd never told her my name. "I was wondering when you'd show up. You've seen the expansions, I take it?" My blood simmered. "Who are you?" I ground out, scanning her nameplate that read Marisol Delgado, HOA president. She offered a polite smile that looked more like a challenge. "I represent the Hillside Trails Homeowners Association. We have a legal deed claiming this land for our new development. We intend to build 29 exclusive, gated homes, beautiful southwestern-style villas that match the region's aesthetic. Once completed, we'll enhance the property values for everyone involved." I stared at her, words failing me at first. My father's land, which we'd meticulously protected, was now dotted with frames of future homes. "You can't be serious," I muttered, finally finding my voice. "I never sold this land. I have the original title. My father left it to me. This is insane." She shrugged, leaning back in her chair with a composed air. "I'm sure we can settle any disagreement over ownership. But in the meantime, the project is well underway. We have all the county permits. If you have a complaint, you can take it up with the county commissioners." There it was, that smug assumption that I was powerless to stop them. My anger nearly made me lunge across the desk, but I forced myself to remain calm. "I'll be sure to do that," I said, glaring at her. "And trust me, you have no idea what you've started." She inclined her head, as though humoring a small child. "Feel free," she said, "but the development won't stop. You might want to prepare for the changes. After all, we do plan to incorporate any unclaimed water sources as well." That remark made my pulse thunder. Unclaimed water sources, she called them. Like a cast-off resource. She had no idea that the well on my father's property was the sole source of water for miles around, and that it was under a long-standing, ironclad water rights agreement Dad had negotiated decades back. If they thought they could simply tap into it, they were in for a rude awakening. I left before I said something I'd regret. The security guard's eyes followed me as I drove away, the hush of the desert broken by heavy machinery in the distance. For the next 2 days, I buried myself in old files, digging up every piece of paper Dad had ever stashed away in his dusty cabin. I found a locked metal trunk containing documents that spelled out water rights, property boundaries, mineral leases, everything. The highlight was a thick stack of legal forms verifying that we, the Spencer family, had priority water rights in this remote region. My father had struck deals with local authorities long ago, ensuring we were recognized as the owners of the only viable well that tapped into an aquifer beneath the parched soil. This wasn't just a trivial detail. In the desert, water is gold. No new development could function without a secure water source. That gave me more leverage than Ms. Delgado could have imagined. Armed with these records, I marched into the county clerk's office. The board clerk barely looked up as I explained my case, but when I showed him the deed from the 1960s and the legal water rights from the 1970s, he finally blinked. "Huh. That's unusual," he said, scrolling through the county's digital records. "It looks like the Hillside Trails HOA submitted a claim to that same area, citing something about a rezoning ordinance, but the date stamps, well, they overlap in a confusing way. This might be a case of a forged annexation or incomplete transfer." My frustration deepened. How had they gotten so far along in construction if the ownership was questionable? The clerk gave a helpless shrug. "Sometimes these projects slip through the cracks if no one files a complaint early on." Slip through the cracks? The project was already half built. I demanded a hearing with the county commissioners. The clerk directed me to file an appeal with the local judge if I wanted an immediate injunction. "It's a steep hill, but you can try," he concluded with an apologetic shrug, as if the system's flaws were out of his hands. I did exactly that, paying a visit to a local lawyer recommended by a friend. The lawyer grimaced as he skimmed the documents I'd brought. "This might be a mess," he said. "HOAs can be relentless, especially if they've greased the right palms in local government. But if your water rights are as ironclad as they appear, that's your golden ticket to stopping this fiasco. Once they realize they can't legally access water for those 29 homes, they'll come begging for a settlement." The thought of Miss Delgado begging for anything made me smile grimly. "Let's make sure we do this by the book," I said. "But let's not let them off easy if they've broken the law." The lawyer nodded, a determined look in his eye. He promised to file the injunction paperwork first thing in the morning. Late that night, I drove out to the desert again. Sleep was impossible. The memory of bulldozed saguaros and half-built houses haunted me. Parking near the ridgeline, I hiked up a small hill that overlooked the entire property. The moon was bright, illuminating the jarring geometry of fresh rooftops and newly laid roads. My father's cabin was hidden behind a cluster of mesquite trees off to the far left. In the distance, I could hear the hum of a generator. They were working non-stop to finish these homes as quickly as possible, probably because they knew if they finished first, it would complicate any demolition order. My fists clenched. Dad had always said if you watch the desert at night, you'll see more than you bargained for. I had never understood that until this moment. Seeing how easily something we cherished could be overtaken by corporate greed, how the hush of the sand and stars could be replaced by the metallic clang of development that was as out of place as an iceberg in the Sahara. The next morning, my lawyer informed me that the judge had agreed to hold a hearing in 2 weeks. That was the earliest we could get on the docket. 2 weeks might be enough time for the HOA to do serious damage, so I decided on another approach too. I'd publicly expose them via local media. I contacted a friend who worked as a journalist at a modestly circulated newspaper. He sounded intrigued. A sprawling desert development constructed on questionable land, possibly involving local corruption or forged documents. He jumped at it, promising to run a story highlighting my father's original ownership and water rights. "This might stir up a hornet's nest," he warned me, "but if it gets public attention, they'll have to slow down, or at least they'll know you're not going quietly." Over the next few days, I gathered more evidence. I snapped photos of half-buried pipelines that presumably ran from my well to the new houses, I confronted a group of construction workers who were digging a trench, and one of them admitted, off the record, they'd been told to keep the project hush-hush. The HOA boss lady said if the county asked, we were just rerouting existing lines. But these lines are brand new, the worker confided, wiping sweat from his brow. I thanked him and told him to stay safe. Clearly, Ms. Delgado thought she could just hijack my water supply. She was about to learn I had the legal muscle to stop her in her tracks. A few days after the newspaper article came out, Ms. Delgado called my cell, the number unknown. I answered warily. Her voice was calm. Too calm. "Mark, we need to talk," she said, skipping any pleasantries. "The story that ran in the paper has upset many of our potential buyers. We'd like to avoid further escalation. Perhaps we can reach an arrangement." I nearly laughed out loud. An arrangement, she called it, as though we were merely bartering over fence lines. "We'll see about that," I replied. "First, you need to halt construction. Then we can discuss compensation for the damage you've done." A pause. "I'm afraid that's not possible," she said, her tone cool. "We have deadlines to meet, and this development is bigger than you realize. Let's not blow things out of proportion." That statement sealed my resolve. "You bulldozed half my desert sanctuary," I hissed. "The only thing that's out of proportion is your arrogance." When the day of the court hearing arrived, the small municipal courthouse was buzzing with reporters and onlookers curious about the dispute. Inside the courtroom, Ms. Delgado sat with two attorneys, both looking smug in expensive suits. My own lawyer gave me a reassuring nod, whispering that we had a solid case. The judge, a graying man who'd spent decades on the bench, glanced at the thick stack of documents and exhaled slowly. "I see we have conflicting claims about land ownership," he began, "and a separate but related issue about water rights." Ms. Delgado's attorney insisted the HOA had legally purchased the land from a previous owner, someone they claimed had the authority to sell. My lawyer countered that Dad never sold anything, that the records were forged, and that county approvals were suspiciously rushed. The judge listened impassively, then turned to me. "Mr. Spencer, do you have evidence to back your claim that the water rights remain solely in your name?" I stood, heart pounding. "Yes, Your Honor. My father secured these rights in 1971 under state law, and we have the official certifications to prove it. Even if the land ownership were in dispute, which I vehemently deny, the water rights were never transferred. They cannot be used without my explicit consent." I handed over the relevant papers. The judge flipped through them, nodding occasionally. Ms. Delgado's attorneys tried to argue that water rights should automatically transfer with the land. But my father had foreseen that possibility, and his documents explicitly separated the well's ownership from the surface land. The judge raised an eyebrow as he read. "This is highly unusual," he muttered. He then looked at Ms. Delgado. "At minimum, it appears you do not have the right to tap Mr. Spencer's well. If that's the only water source for these houses, your entire project may be in jeopardy." Ms. Delgado's face hardened, but she kept her composure. The hearing ended with the judge granting a temporary injunction, preventing the HOA from drawing water from my well until the final property ownership case could be resolved. It was a partial victory. They could still build, but they couldn't legally connect to my water supply, and in the desert, that was essentially a death sentence for new development. Without water, no prospective buyer could ever move in. Over the next week, the tension ratcheted up. Ms. Delgado openly defied the injunction, instructing her crews to continue laying water pipes from my well to the newly built homes. I caught them in the act and called the sheriff, who seemed reluctant to get involved in a civil matter. Furious, I realized Ms. Delgado likely had connections in the local government, maybe even the sheriff's office. If the sheriff wouldn't enforce the court order, I'd have to escalate in other ways. Word of mouth spread through the region. People whispered that the Hillside Trails HOA had used intimidation to push out smaller ranchers, that they'd gotten special treatment from county officials who wanted to see high-end housing developments flourish. Some neighbors sided with me, outraged that pristine desert was being torn apart. Others shrugged, saying money talks, but I had an ace up my sleeve. The water rights were still mine, and no amount of bribed officials could override that in a higher court. One late afternoon, I pulled up to the construction site, my site, and found Ms. Delgado personally overseeing a crew running plastic piping across the ground, presumably to link the well to the gated homes. My fury flared. Jumping out of my truck, I stormed over and confronted her. "What part of the judge's injunction do you not understand?" I demanded, my voice echoing across the dusty plain. She turned, expression steely. "I understand you're trying to sabotage our community. We're providing housing for dozens of families. That's bigger than your personal grudge. The nerve of it. This community of yours is built on land that doesn't belong to you, using water rights you have no claim to. Don't talk to me about sabotage when you're the one bulldozing entire ecosystems." She eyed me with barely concealed contempt. "You'd prefer to let this desert remain unused, all in the name of some sentimental attachment. Our buyers want scenic desert views, not a barren wasteland." I laughed bitterly. "Barren wasteland? People like you never see the beauty in what's already here. You only see dollar signs. Well, good luck building a community with no water." Then I nodded pointedly at the crew. "You're all in violation of a court order. I'm giving you one last chance to pack up and leave before I escalate this." Ms. Delgado's lips thinned. "You do what you have to. I have attorneys to handle any escalation." Then she turned her back on me, barking orders at her workers. She'd called my bluff, but if there was one thing I'd learned from my father, it was never to bluff about matters this serious. I marched straight to the county courthouse, demanding an emergency hearing for contempt of court. My lawyer filed the necessary paperwork, presenting evidence, including photos and timestamps, showing Ms. Delgado continuing to lay water lines despite the injunction. The judge, looking irritated and possibly embarrassed at the sheriff's lack of enforcement, scheduled a contempt hearing within 3 days. He didn't mince words. If Ms. Delgado was found in contempt, she could face fines or even jail time. When that day arrived, Ms. Delgado's bravado finally cracked. Her lawyers tried to spin some story about how they were merely testing the ground, not actually hooking into the well. But my photos told a different tale. The judge hammered them with pointed questions, eventually concluding Ms. Delgado had willfully defied the injunction. He imposed a hefty fine on the HOA, and warned that continued defiance would lead to more severe consequences. Ms. Delgado left the courtroom with a stormy expression, refusing to meet my gaze. By now, local news stations were sniffing around, interviewing me in the courthouse hallway, asking how it felt to challenge an entire HOA. I told them the truth. I wasn't just fighting for myself, but for the integrity of the desert and the memory of my father who had fought so hard to protect it. But Ms. Delgado was nothing if not resourceful. Shortly after the contempt hearing, I heard rumors she was negotiating with a neighboring rancher to buy rights to a different water source. That neighbor, a man named Collins, had a smaller well on his land, though it was rumored to be nearly dried up. He'd struggled with finances for years, and Ms. Delgado dangled a generous sum in exchange for letting the HOA tap into his well. If she succeeded, that would neutralize my greatest leverage, so I paid Collins a visit. He lived in a ramshackle trailer on a dusty plot of land. When he saw me, his eyes narrowed warily. He knew me by reputation, presumably. Over lukewarm iced tea, I explained the situation, trying to appeal to his sense of fairness. "If you sell them the rights, they'll bleed your well dry. You'll be left with nothing. They'll move on to greener pastures, leaving you in the dust." Collins listened, rubbing his temples, looking torn. Finally, he muttered that Ms. Delgado had offered him enough money to clear his debts. He had kids in college, bills piling up, and he was out of options. I felt a pang of empathy. "What if there's another way?" I asked. "Maybe I can help you get a better deal, or we can pool resources. The county is starting to investigate them for fraud. If the development fails, you won't be forced to rely on that sale. Just give me a chance to see this through." Collins hesitated, eyes flicking back and forth as though searching for an escape. Ultimately, he said he'd hold off finalizing anything for a week. That was all the time I needed. The county's formal investigation into the land ownership began to ramp up. More and more evidence emerged, that Ms. Delgado or her associates had altered property records at the clerk's office. Some documents were backdated, some mysteriously missing. A whistleblower from inside the county staff came forward, claiming Delgado had donated a large sum to a local official's re-election campaign right before the rezoning was approved. The media seized on these revelations, fueling public outrage. People questioned how an HOA could simply commandeer land without rightful ownership. The answer: it couldn't. Not without a healthy dose of corruption. Meanwhile, the half-finished gated community stood in awkward limbo. Ms. Delgado had managed to complete about 2/3 of the houses, but no one dared move in when the entire project was mired in legal battles and, more critically, had no guaranteed water supply. The once quiet desert echoed with the hammering of construction by day and fell silent at night. The unfinished structures looming like monuments to arrogance. The only sign of life came from Ms. Delgado's occasional visits in her sleek SUV, presumably to reassure the construction crews that all was not lost. But even they seemed to be growing nervous. Without a stable water source, everything was at risk of collapsing. Tensions escalated further when the local environmental board got involved, triggered by a complaint I'd filed regarding the destruction of protected cacti and potential harm to desert wildlife. Ms. Delgado was slapped with an additional citation for removing saguaros without the proper permits. That might have been a smaller offense compared to forging land documents, but it piled on the pressure. The more agencies scrutinized the development, the more obvious it became that Hillside Trails was a house of cards. A second hearing regarding the property ownership was scheduled, this time with a more senior judge who had the authority to issue a final ruling. Ms. Delgado's lawyers tried to delay, citing missing evidence and ongoing negotiations, but the judge refused to grant them more time. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse brimmed with reporters and curious locals. Ms. Delgado arrived, looking dignified yet tense, flanked by her attorneys. I walked in with my lawyer, armed with a thick binder of evidence that included the questionable land deeds, the bribery allegations, and the original water rights my father had secured decades earlier. The hearing stretched on for hours, with each side calling witnesses and presenting documents. Ms. Delgado's attorneys argued that their client purchased the land in good faith, from an entity that claimed to be the rightful owner. My lawyer tore that argument apart, pointing to the records that showed the chain of title never left my family. The final blow came when the county staff whistleblower testified, under oath, that Ms. Delgado's name appeared on multiple suspicious transaction records that aligned perfectly with the forged documents' timeline. By late afternoon, the judge looked thoroughly exasperated with Ms. Delgado's team. In his concluding statement, he stated there was clear and convincing evidence that the land was never lawfully transferred to Hillside Trails HO, and that any construction carried out was unapproved and unauthorized. As for the water rights, the judge affirmed they were fully and unequivocally mine. His voice echoed in the courtroom. Any attempt to utilize Mr. Spencer's water source without his written consent is illegal and subject to further penalties. Ms. Delgado sat rigid, her eyes downcast, as the judge ordered all development activities to cease immediately. If that order was ignored, the county sheriff would be compelled to intervene. When the gavel slammed, I felt a surge of relief so powerful I almost forgot to breathe. We'd won. The desert sanctuary would not be lost to greed and corruption. But there was more to do. After the hearing, Ms. Delgado stood outside the courthouse flanked by reporters. She tried to spin it, telling them she was just another victim of shady land dealers. The local TV station broadcast her trembling voice, claiming she'd spent the HOA's funds in good faith and that the real blame lay with unscrupulous middlemen. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But she'd personally bulldozed my father's beloved cacti, personally threatened me, personally tried to defy the court's order. She was no innocent bystander. If the county's follow-up investigation verified the bribery rumors, Ms. Delgado would likely face criminal charges. The following week, all construction stopped cold. The half-built houses sat in silence, drifting piles of sand accumulating around their foundations. Workers packed up their equipment, Some were furious, having been promised months more of steady employment. Others quietly thanked me for exposing the project's fraud, saying they'd never seen such shady dealings in broad daylight. The fiasco left an eerie scar in the desert, a silent testament to what can happen when big ambitions collide with the unyielding truth. Word spread that Ms. Delgado was scrambling to find any solution that would salvage the millions already spent on the development. She might try to resell the unfinished homes, but no buyer would touch them without water. She might beg me for access to the well, but that ship had sailed. I fully intended to keep the well under tight lock and key, just as Dad would have. Our land was not for sale, not for forced annexation, and certainly not for fueling a misguided dream that trashed the environment. If Ms. Delgado was thirsty for water, well, she picked the wrong desert rat to mess with. A month later, the county commissioners held a public forum to address the fiasco. Furious residents who'd already put down deposits on future homes demanded refunds. Some turned their anger on Ms. Delgado. Others scolded the county for letting the development get as far as it did. One commissioner publicly apologized for the oversight, implying some staffers were being fired or investigated. My father's legacy was mentioned multiple times, praising him as a man who championed responsible land stewardship. I stood quietly in the back, arms crossed, listening to the meltdown. Part of me felt vindicated, but another part grieved the unnecessary destruction of nature that could never be fully restored. I thought of the saguaros that used to tower over the sand, now nothing but stumps and memory. As for Ms. Delgado, I heard she resigned from the HOA presidency shortly after that meeting. Rumor had it she was trying to avoid deeper legal scrutiny. A new, more sympathetic board took over Hillside Trails, though what they planned to do with 29 partially built homes in the desert stripped of water rights was anyone's guess. They reached out to me through an attorney, suggesting a reasonable settlement might allow them to buy the well. I refused. Money wasn't the issue, it was about preserving Dad's land, preserving the fragile desert ecosystem, and standing up to the arrogance that threatened both. I wrote a polite but firm response. The well was not for sale. Any further attempts to bypass the judge's ruling would be met with immediate legal action. In the months that followed, the desert began to reclaim the edges of that ill-fated development. Sand drifted across unfinished roads. Desert brush sprouted round the foundations, turning them into skeletal reminders of an overreach. Coyotes took to prowling around the vacant lots, apparently unfazed by the leftover debris. The desert, it seemed, was in the process of swallowing up Ms. Delgado's vision. Meanwhile, I spent more time than ever at the old cabin, ensuring the well was secure and maintaining the property lines. The legal ordeal had left me exhausted but strangely fulfilled. My father's land was still my land, still untamed, still full of quiet wonders if you knew how to look. One final chapter remained. About 6 months after the fiasco, I received an envelope from Ms. Delgado delivered by certified mail. Inside was a single-page letter. She wrote that she was deeply sorry for the harm caused and that she recognized she was misled about the property's legal status. She claimed her intentions were to create a sustainable desert community, but conceded that corner-cutting and questionable alliances led her astray. The letter ended with a plea. If I ever changed my mind about letting the houses use my water, she would be open to an arrangement that honored the environment. I read it twice, searching for sincerity. Maybe she truly regretted her actions. Maybe she just wanted to salvage her financial losses. In either case, I had no desire to strike a deal. I filed the letter away with the rest of the documents, uncertain if I'd ever respond. In the end, justice prevailed in a system that's often too broken to protect the little guys. Dad's desert sanctuary remained a sanctuary, albeit scarred by the half-finished shells that dotted the far side of the property. I reached out to a local conservation group and we discussed plans to rehabilitate the damaged areas, maybe remove the partially built houses and let the desert fully reclaim itself. Funding would be a challenge and the legalities were complex, but I was determined to see it through. If that meant years of court battles or appeals to philanthropic donors, so be it. This land was worth every ounce of effort. Sometimes I stand by the old well at dusk, the sky bathed in fiery oranges and purples. and I listen to the faint trickle of water hidden deep beneath the sand. I think about how Ms. Delgado presumed she could just tap into that supply, how she believed money and influence could conquer a centuries-old ecosystem. The desert has a way of humbling those who misunderstand its harsh rhythms and fierce protections. It also has a way of rewarding those who stand by it, who see its beauty and vow to shield it from exploitation. Dad taught me that. And thanks to that lesson, I ended up with more than just paper deeds. I ended up with a piece of the world that can't be bought, no matter how many checks Ms. Delgado or her ilk might write. To anyone reading this story, take note. Water in the desert is life itself. It's not something you steal on a whim or claim with forged documents. You earn it through respect, stewardship, and an understanding that some corners of this earth aren't meant to be carved into identical suburban lots. The Hillside Trails HOA discovered that the hard way. They built 29 gated homes on land that never belonged to them, ignoring local culture, ignoring the environment, ignoring every warning sign. Then they tried to siphon water they had no right to, and now they're left with shells of houses and a dead-end project, while I hold all the cards and the water firmly in my grasp. Perhaps Ms. Delgado was correct about one thing. The desert is merciless. But in the end, it was her own greed that truly left them thirsty. Because out here in the blazing sun, every drop of water has a story. And this one ended with the rightful owner standing tall, a half-finished ghost town behind him, and a desert sanctuary still breathing beneath the starlit sky.